There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a farm pond in western Michigan just before sunrise. Mist curls off the surface like steam off a cup of coffee. A bullfrog grunts somewhere in the cattails, and if you listen closely, you can hear the soft slap of a largemouth bass breaking the surface to snatch a mayfly. For 79 years, that quiet belonged to one family, and in the summer of 2019, that quiet was broken forever. Not by a storm, not by drought, but by something far more dangerous: money, silence, and a chemical nobody could see, smell, or taste. This is the story of Henry Bakker, a retired dairyman with hands like weathered oak bark, and the 2-acre pond his grandfather Cornelius dug by hand and mule team back in 1941 on the family's farm outside Holland, Michigan. It is a story about forever chemicals, a courtroom battle that nearly bankrupted a family before it made them millionaires, and a piece of tackle buried in the mud that changed the entire case. The names and some details here have been reshaped for storytelling, but the science, the legal mechanics, and the stakes are drawn straight from real fights happening on farms across America right now. Cornelius Bakker came to Ottawa County from the province of Zeeland in the Netherlands in 1923, part of the wave of Dutch immigrants who settled the fruit belt along Lake Michigan's eastern shore. He planted tart cherries, ran a small herd of Holsteins, and in a low spot behind the barn where spring water pooled every March, he decided to dig a pond. He wanted somewhere to water cattle, somewhere to cut ice in winter, and as he told his son years later, somewhere for a tired man to sit at the end of a long day and watch a bobber. That pond became the emotional center of the Bakker farm. Henry's father stocked it with bluegill and largemouth bass in the 1950s, using stock brought up from a state fish hatchery, a common practice under Michigan's farm pond management programs. Bluegill were chosen because they are prolific spawners, building shallow, saucer-shaped nests in colonies along the shoreline gravel, which makes them easy to establish and hard to wipe out. Largemouth bass were added at a predator-to-prey ratio recommended by extension biologists, roughly 1 bass fingerling for every 10 to 20 bluegill, so the bass would keep the panfish population in check and prevent the pond from becoming overcrowded with stunted fish. By the time Henry inherited the farm in 1988, the pond had a reputation. Neighbors' kids learned to cast a line there. His own 3 children were baptized in the church down the road and taught to fillet a bluegill on the same weathered picnic table by the water. Every 4th of July, the extended Bakker family, cousins from Grand Rapids, an aunt who had moved to Zeeland in Holland itself and flew back every other summer, gathered at that pond for a fish fry that had run uninterrupted for over 6 decades. The first sign of trouble came in late June 2019. Henry noticed a greenish-gray scum forming along the northern bank, thicker than the usual seasonal algae bloom he'd seen 100 times before. Farm ponds naturally experience algae growth as water warms and nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen accumulate, especially in a pond fed partly by agricultural runoff. But this was different. The bluegill he pulled up over the following week had lesions on their fins. A week after that, he found 11 dead largemouth bass floating belly up near the spillway, some of them fish he had watched grow for a decade. Henry called the Ottawa County Conservation District, who sent out a fisheries technician. The technician performed an electrofishing survey, a standard method where a boat-mounted generator sends a mild electrical current into the water that temporarily stuns fish so they float to the surface for counting and inspection without killing them. What she found troubled her: a dissolved oxygen reading that was low but not catastrophic, and fish showing symptoms that didn't quite match a typical oxygen die-off or algae toxin event. She recommended water and sediment sampling. The results came back 6 weeks later, and they were the kind of results that change a family's life. The pond water contained elevated levels of PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, a family of thousands of synthetic compounds used since the 1940s in non-stick coatings, firefighting foam, and industrial manufacturing. PFAS compounds are sometimes called forever chemicals because their carbon-fluorine bonds are among the strongest in organic chemistry and do not break down naturally in the environment. They accumulate in soil, migrate through groundwater, and bioaccumulate in the tissue of fish and animals, meaning concentrations increase as you move up the food chain, from insects to bluegill to the largemouth bass that eat them, and potentially to the people who eat the bass. The state lab found PFAS levels in the Bakker Pond's fish tissue over 40 times higher than Michigan's do not eat threshold. The signs Henry had been ignoring, the funny taste in the fish 2 summers running, his own persistent headaches after weekends spent netting minnows, suddenly had a name. Here is where the story turns from a fish kill into an investigation, and where a bit of hydrogeology becomes essential. A pond like the Bakkers is not a sealed container. It sits atop an aquifer, connected to groundwater through porous glacial till common across western Michigan, sediment left behind by retreating ice sheets some 11,000 years ago. Water moves through this substrate slowly, sometimes just a few feet per year, carrying whatever is dissolved in it. That means contamination introduced miles away can show up in a farm pond years later, arriving quietly through the ground rather than dramatically down a stream. An environmental engineering firm hired by the Bakker's attorney used monitoring wells and dye tracing to map the groundwater plume. Dye tracing involves introducing a harmless fluorescent dye at a suspected source and watching where it resurfaces, a technique hydrogeologists have used for over a century to prove connections between distant water bodies. The trail led 2.5 miles northeast to a stretch of leased farmland where, starting in 2015, a company we'll call Meridian Agro-Solutions had been spreading biosolids, treated sewage sludge marketed as fertilizer, under a state permit. Biosolids application is legal and common. Treated sludge is regulated under federal rules and can be a genuinely useful soil amendment, rich in nitrogen and organic matter. But not all biosolids are created equal, and testing showed the batches Meridian had spread on that field originated from a wastewater treatment plant that processed industrial discharge from a chrome plating and textile coating operation upstream, a known source of PFAS. Internal emails later produced in discovery showed a Meridian environmental compliance officer had flagged elevated PFAS readings in a 2016 internal soil test and recommended against continued application on fields near surface water. The recommendation was never acted upon. To fully assess the contamination and begin remediation, the Bakker's environmental team recommended draining the pond entirely, a drastic step, but the only way to excavate and remove contaminated sediment from the bottom rather than simply treating the water above it. Draining a pond this size takes patience. A siphon and pump system lowered the water level gradually over 11 days to avoid a sudden pressure change that can destabilize the earthen dam built by Cornelius Bakker 8 decades earlier. As the water dropped, the pond gave up its history. Old horseshoes. A rusted milk can. The skeletal remains of a rowboat that had sunk sometime in the 1970s. And then, buried in the clay near what had once been the deepest hole of the pond, one of the crew found a small tin tackle box, sealed shut with rust, engraved with the initials CB, Cornelius Bakker. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept most of the moisture out, were hand-tied flies, a brass fishing reel, and a folded water-stained note in Dutch that Henry's aunt later translated, a simple line thanking God for the water and the land, dated 1952. That tackle box became more than a sentimental find. Henry's attorney used it, and photographs of the drained, contaminated pond bottom next to the box to make the human stakes of the case impossible to ignore. This was not an abstract environmental violation. It was 3 generations of a family's memory, sitting in poisoned mud. Meridian Agro-Solutions initially offered the Bakkers a settlement of $80,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. Henry refused. He had, by his own account, no interest in getting rich off it. He wanted the company held accountable and the pond made safe again for his grandchildren. His attorney, a Grand Rapids litigator who had handled agricultural contamination cases before, filed suit under Michigan's Environmental Protection Act, along with claims of negligence, private nuisance, and trespass, arguing that the migration of contaminated groundwater onto the Bakker property constituted an unauthorized physical intrusion onto their land. The case took 3 years to reach trial, a timeline not unusual for environmental litigation involving expert hydrogeology, toxicology, and corporate discovery. Meridian's defense argued that PFAS was ubiquitous in the environment already, present in rainwater and consumer products nationwide, and that establishing their biosolids as the specific source was speculative. This is a real and recurring defense strategy in PFAS litigation across the country, since these chemicals are so widespread that proving a single point source requires careful chemical fingerprinting. The Bakker's expert witness, a hydrogeologist, testified using isotopic and compound-specific analysis, showing that the unique ratio of PFAS variants found in the pond sediment matched almost precisely the chemical signature found in Meridian's biosolid stockpile, a match the defense's own retained expert struggled to explain away under cross-examination. A toxicologist testified to Henry's elevated blood PFAS levels, more than 4 times the national average reported by the CDC's biomonitoring program, and to documented health effects associated with long-term PFAS exposure, including links to kidney and testicular cancer risk and immune system impacts found in peer-reviewed epidemiological studies. The most powerful testimony, though, came from Henry himself. He did not talk about property values or diminished land use. He talked about teaching his granddaughter to bait a hook, the way his father had taught him, and having to tell her, at 8 years old, that the pond was no longer safe to swim in. After 11 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. They found Meridian Agro Solutions liable on all 4 counts. The compensatory award covered remediation costs, including full excavation and replacement of contaminated pond sediment, well testing, and municipal water hookup for 2 neighboring properties also found to be affected, and long-term medical monitoring for the Bakker family. But it was the punitive damages that made headlines across Michigan and beyond. The jury found that Meridian had acted with reckless disregard after ignoring its own 2016 internal warning, and awarded punitive damages that brought the total verdict to just over $11 million. It is worth understanding why juries in cases like this sometimes award damages far beyond the immediate cleanup cost. Punitive damages exist under American tort law, specifically to punish conduct a jury finds especially reckless or intentional, and to deter similar conduct by others, not merely to compensate a victim, but to send a signal. Cases like this one echo real verdicts across American agriculture in recent years. Farmers in Missouri who won hundreds of millions from herbicide manufacturers over drift damage. Texas ranchers who sued fertilizer companies over PFAS contaminated biosolids that killed cattle. And communities that have won multi-million-dollar settlements over groundwater contamination tied to industrial and agricultural sources. The pattern is consistent. When a company had specific internal knowledge of a risk and continued the harmful practice anyway, juries do not treat that lightly. Remediation began the following spring. Excavators removed nearly 4 feet of contaminated sediment from the pond floor, hauling it to a licensed hazardous waste facility rather than simply relocating the problem. The earthen dam was rebuilt and reinforced with a modern clay core designed to reduce seepage, and the pond was relined with a mixture of bentonite clay to help seal the bottom against further groundwater exchange from the affected aquifer layer. Fisheries biologists tested the restored water quarterly for 18 months before certifying it safe, then restocked it with bluegill, reindeer sunfish, and largemouth bass sourced from a certified hatchery, following the same predator-prey stocking ratios that had guided Cornelius Bakker's original stocking 70 years before. Henry used a portion of the settlement to establish a small conservation easement over the pond and the surrounding 15 acres of wetland, placing the water permanently off-limits to future industrial leasing, in partnership with a regional land trust. The rest went toward his grandchildren's education, a new roof on the dairy barn, and a modest donation to the county conservation district that had first flagged the contamination. Cornelius Bakker's tackle box now sits in a glass case near the fireplace in Henry's farmhouse. The tin still faintly rust-streaked, the tide flies inside preserved behind museum glass. Above it hangs a photograph, taken the following 4th of July, of 4 generations of the Bakker family standing at the edge of the restored pond, fishing rods in hand, the water behind them clear enough to see the gravel bottom for the first time in years. Henry still fishes that pond most summer evenings. He says the bluegill bite better now than they have in a decade, which the biologists tell him makes sense. A freshly restocked pond, free of legacy contamination and stunted overcrowded populations, often produces some of its best fishing in the years right after a full restoration. Some might call that irony. Henry calls it his grandfather's water, finally clean again, and worth more to him than any number a jury could write on a check.